Okay. Bienvenidos. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes, everybody here in London. I'm Victor Ugarte, the director here. So I'm delighted to welcome Mark Stuart-Smith, whose book, Juan Muñoz, The Politics of Silence, we are celebrating and discussing tonight, and Maripaz Valibrea Enriquez, who will be joining him in conversation about the book. Dr. Maripaz Valibrea is reader in Spanish Cultural Studies at the School of Creative Arts, Culture and Communication at Birkbeck. Sorry, the mispronunciation. Her research on the political role of culture in contemporary Spain currently focuses on the new historiographies of Spanish Republican exile. She's the author of several books, including a study on the multifaceted novelist and poet Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, entitled En la Tierra Baldía, and more recently, Tiempo de Exilio and the Global Cultural Capital, addressing the citizen and producing the city of Barcelona. She was also the editor coordinator for the monumental Líneas de Fuga, hacia otra historiografía cultural del exilio republicano español, a multidisciplinary exploration of the intellectual and literary work of Spanish Republican exiles. Mark Stuart-Smith completed a PhD on Juan Muñoz's work at Birkbeck, supervised by Maripaz Valibrea and by Professor Simon Shaw Miller, who may be here tonight, I'm not sure. I thought he was coming. He was previously published on Juan Muñoz on Spanish memory studies and Spanish art history in distinguished journals in the field. His book, which he and Maripaz will be discussing tonight, is published as part of Peter Lang's Cultural Memories series, edited by Katia Pizzi, who's here tonight. Thank you for being here. The Cultural Memories series is based on the Center for the Studies of Cultural Memory at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, where Mark completed a master's degree in cultural memory in 2007. After the conversation, and I invite you everybody to have a glass of Spanish wine after enjoying this lecture about this incredible artist. I love him very much. We lost it very young. And he was very linked to London. So I think we will enjoy very much your conversation in such a great artist as Juan. Thank you very much.
Shall I say a couple of words before we start? A couple of words of thank you. First to the Instituto Cervantes, to Victor Ugarte and Juan Blas for hosting this event. From my editors, Katia Pizzi and Laura Platt also, who did an amazing job, and for their wonderful support. There is quite a long list of thank yous in the book, but just to say thank you to Maripaz for generously coming in and discussing the book with me today.
Okay, so, thank you. Is that okay? Well, thank you also, and thank you to Victor and to the Instituto Cervantes here in London for inviting me to share in what is, as Victor was saying, a celebration of your book, and for thinking of me, to take part in this conversation. I'm very glad to be here, and in a sense, I'm also, it's a bit embarrassing, but I'm also a bit proud por la parte que me toca, as we say in Spanish, for having been a part, putting you on track to produce such an accomplished book by being one of your supervisors, along with Simon Shaw Miller at Birkbeck. This is going to sound, again, like a cliche, but it's really not. I enjoyed this book so much, Mark. I think it's a great book. It's beautifully written. It gripped me from the beginning to the end, and it really gives, it really brings for the reader the fascinating figure that Juan Muñoz was and the importance of his art. The book does what it says on the tin. I mean, it's really a complex study of silence as a central trope in the art and in the poetics of Juan Muñoz, and then the different political implications of those artistic choices. But even more generally, it gives one with the sense, after one has finished the book, that you really learn so much about Juan Muñoz. You have a really coherent sense of what the artist and his work meant and their importance. So this is, I think, a really important book on Juan Muñoz. The book covers different periods, from the early period to the late period, so one gets a sense of the trajectory and the development in his preoccupations. I also appreciated a lot in the book that you don't only get such a complex sense of the different works, but also you get a sense of Muñoz as an intellectual, very much as someone who was really erudite and interested in art criticism, in history of art, modernism, in particular the Renaissance, the Baroque, also in architecture and philosophy, mostly Benjamin, but also Foucault, Barthes, Levinas, and he wrote about all of these things. He wrote essays and articles, he wrote a notebook, he gave interviews when he talked about those things, and all of that you include is brought to bear in your analysis and interpretations of Muñoz. So that the combination of all of that really gives a sense of very solid, very nuanced and rich analysis. So it seems to me that this book will be of interest to anybody who is concerned with questions of postmodernity and modernity, the relations, the ruptures, the connections, continuities between those two moments or approaches to art. It will be of interest to those concerned with British art from the 1970s to the turn of our century. Those also interested in Spanish art, but not only on the Spanish art, but also those interested in questions of memory. Rightly so, your book is included in a series that is devoted to cultural memory, and certainly the question of historical memory in Spain, the question of dealing with the difficult past, the traumatic past of the Spanish Civil War, the dictatorship, and how that was done after the end of the dictatorship in the democratic post-dictatorial period, and how culture kind of intervened in those discussions. That is also very important and very central to the book. So there is also, even for those who are not centrally concerned with art, will find a lot of interest in reading your book. I just wanted to say those things because they were the kind of general ideas that helped me to situate your book, and I hope started a conversation with you, because I'm not going to be, luckily to all of you, I'm not going to be talking anymore. I'll shut up now, because what we really want is to listen to you, and we've prepared a conversation that will give Mark the opportunity to tell us more in depth about particular aspects of the work, and he's prepared also a PowerPoint presentation, so we'll have an opportunity to see some of Muñoz's wonderful art. So without further ado.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Very generous.
Of course. So let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us how you became interested in Juan Muñoz, and what attracted to you to his work, and how you decided to start writing about him, researching about him in a PhD, and then writing another book.
Well, I started with visiting Spain from the early 90s, and gradually getting a sense of what it was like being in the villages in deep Castile, and then starting to wonder about what had happened, and having a certain sense of emptiness or something missing. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but when I started the Cultural Memories Masters, that gave me the opportunity to think about, to research a bit more about what had happened, how people had processed the past, and ultimately how artists had started to think about it, what artists had to say about the past. And I looked at a spectrum of artists, first of all painters, and I couldn't see anything there I could get hold of really, particularly. I looked at sculptors who seemed more interesting from that period, the 80s and 90s, and Juan Muñoz just stood out as somebody who was really kind of awkward, and there was a kind of quite intriguing dark atmosphere about the work, but it was kind of funny and there was a witty sort of edge to the work, but I didn't really understand what was going on. So I really wanted to try and understand what was happening there. He spoke, it was very striking that he spoke about memory, and he wrote about memory in the abstracts, but never referring to particular memories. So it was as if he was pointing to something and also hiding at the same time. And this turned out increasingly to be a kind of a very, very strong dynamic throughout his work, the pointing and the hiding. And I saw, oops, so this was the first work which really kind of captivated me. And I was lucky enough that just before the beginning of the PhD, there was a big retrospective at Tate Modern, and I kind of followed it all around Europe actually. It went to Bilbao and Madrid. So I saw this and many other works in different situations, which was very good. And I spent a lot of time in these installations, looking at these works, and actually seeing the work in a Spanish context is curiously different from seeing it in a British context. A different feel about it. Just, I think part of that is it goes home to Madrid, to the Reina Sofia, but it's comfortable there, but it's, I don't know, there seems to be a friction between the work and its surroundings in some way. So this is the kind of trigger. And this is the first work I started writing about.
Okay, and so when you started to write about Muñoz, how did you find the field of critics or scholars? Was there already work written on him? How did you start finding an angle and areas where you thought that you could make an intervention, and what was that intervention?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the question of memory came up very quickly. I was prepared. I was already kind of primed for that. I've been through the masters. What was then the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies. So I was looking for memory in a sense. found that also very quickly the question of the silencing of memory, the silencing of the past, started to come up as a constant. And it seemed to me that a lot of the critics, a lot of the people who are writing about Muñoz, often in a very beautiful literary way, very imaginative, heavy-duty writers, were not looking very closely at the works necessarily. And perhaps the most helpful writer of all was a close friend of Muñoz's in the early 80s, José Luis Brea. And they were like accomplices, partners in crime for 2 or 3 years, and they collaborated, and they were very close, and I think they kind of sparked off each other. And Brea's account of Muñoz's work was by far the most interesting and helpful that I came across. But again, his commentaries were very abstract, and he didn't examine individual works. So there seemed to be a few gaps there. I think the other thing about the historiography is that Muñoz kind of pivoted towards the Anglo-Saxon world in some sense from the early 90s. And so a lot of people who were writing about Muñoz weren't necessarily so attuned to the Spanish context, the cultural memory. So the kind of consensus was a more generalized kind of postmodern account. So again, there seemed to be gaps opening up.
Do you want to say a bit more about something that I made reference to before, which is how you work in every chapter pretty much with both the specific installations, sculptures and so on, and different writings of Muñoz, and how you made one speak about the other, I think in an extremely productive way, and also innovative. Am I right in thinking this is not anything that anybody else had done in terms of interpreting Muñoz's work?
Yeah, I think people have used the writings, but perhaps at times they've used writings as kind of directly usable commentaries on the work without any further interrogation needed. I think the writings are extremely helpful, but the relationship between the writings and the installations, the other works, is complex and it's changing. He's often using the writings as a kind of parallel medium for thinking through similar questions. So he said about his sculptural works that he used them to explain things to himself that he couldn't explain in any other medium. Mm-hmm. So, this is really central to his work, the kind of the things that you can do in one medium but can't do in another, or the gaps between the mediums and what happens when you take away one medium, or certainly the kind of the absolutely fluid changing movement between mediums. But the gaps are very, very important. What happens in the gaps? The first image that, let's see, yes, this is the first one which really kind of demonstrated that there was a very close, intimate relationship between the writing and the image making, the sculpture making. This is an extraordinary article which was actually published in German, so probably wasn't that well noticed in Spain at the time. It was published in an Austrian magazine, in 1988. And a way that's quite recurs again and again in Muñoz's writing. He places two images which are from disparate, very, very distant historical periods, which are quite unlike, and he gets them to spark off each other. And this one is actually the essay, which is called The Time of the Pose, is like an absolutely perverse allegory of silencing, of historical silencing. So what he notices here, this amazing photograph by Agustín Ventriloquism, which he dates wrongly, 35, because it's actually an absolutely pivotal moment in 36, in the lead up to the Civil War. So this is a blatantly political photograph, and he treats it as if it's a painting. So he compares the two, and he gives a kind of a very, very obviously theatrical kind of formalist reading of the photograph. I mean, there's a if I could just read it, there's a quote which is quite nice, which is describing the photograph. He says, let me find it. The figure, who is the figure in the middle, is the worker surrounded by the Guardia d'Assalto. The figure has forgotten his part. Interrupted in his presentation, he directs a frozen stare towards the prompter. He waits for his next cue. He stands there, immobile, and does not move as the curtain falls. The prompter waits in his little box in the floor, the photographer behind his camera, and neither says a word. They simply contemplate the beauty of the moment. So that kind of, it's like a really provocative kind of aestheticization of something which is thoroughly political. And the thing that that brings these two together, as I'm sure you've noticed, is the kind of the geometry of these figures, of three figures around the different fourth figure. And I couldn't get the copyright to do a drawing on it, so I did a diagram. But that's the, oops, that's obviously the street scene again, with the three against the one. And so by analogy, one can see a geometry in a contemporary work here. So this was the first work which really alerted me to the way he was thinking through these problems of human geometries and otherness in different mediums at the same time. So this dwarf with three columns is a kind of deceptively empty work, but like many of these works, an accumulation of cultural associations and just the kind of the idea of the geometry. If one sort of explores the associations, the work kind of yields a sense of drawing the viewer into a kind of perceptual trap. So by analogy with Muñoz's essay, one could see the kind of the functioning of allegory. I don't know if that's clear. It's rather a complicated connection between the two.
I mean, it is clear that the emphasis seems to be on the positionality and the structure of all these different artistic forms, including his own, right? And so he seems to be insisting on, on form as the thing that connects all of these different artistic expressions. But I think what you also argue is that in an indirect way, the allusion to, particularly the Centellas photograph, it is by so blatantly wanting to stay completely away from any historical reference or any political reference that the pointing to and hiding at the same time isn't that part of your
Yes,
argument?
very
Because
much so, yeah. I mean, I think that seems to be a very provocative gesture, and it says a lot about his own. I mean, I think it suggests quite a lot about his own concern with the past and his own ambivalence, and perhaps that he felt that speaking about these things directly in Spain in Spanish would have been problematic. So he does it in German, in Austria, where it wasn't going to be picked up, and it's an essay which hasn't been commented on. It hasn't been picked up by critics on the whole, not in this connection.
Shall we talk a bit more about, specifically about this indirectness and this silence that somehow points to, but it's always shy from saying things directly, and connecting that to the politics, which is also part of the title of your book. A lot of your argument hinges on opposites, right? And the tensions and the gaps that exist, that are creating in Muñoz's arts between those opposites. A tension and a gap that is never it never finds a synthesis. It never progresses. I mean, it stays there. And it is in that gap, in that silence, that, everything hinges, politics and everything. I mean, you do a lot with those opposites, and they kind of reproduce themselves in forms that give new nuances, but at the same time, it seems to me, enrich that central argument. I wrote something down, showing and hiding, as we're talking about here, memory and forgetting, truth and myth or trick, humor and horror, monument and ruin, belief and betrayal, perpetrators and victims, presence and absence, structure and entropy. Say more about, choose some, because we're not going to have time. Choose some of these pairs and give us a flavor of, how much is at stake in your argument, in creating those pairs and
as you say,
opposites.
Yes, as you say, the title is The Politics of Silence, the subtitle is The Politics of Silence, and that places two politics in tension with each other, his politics and the politics that was happening around him, the politics of the new Spain. And I think what happens around about 1982 when he comes back to Spain is that from being a student full of radical ideas and experimenting with ideas of radical politics, he suddenly collides with the reality of making a career in an environment which is changing incredibly rapidly, where the kind of counterculture of the early Movida is being converted, it's been turned upside down, it's becoming culture industry and society of the spectacle kind of overnight. And this is very energetically and expensively promoted by the new socialist government. And what he finds himself from sympathising with the political position of the outsider, he suddenly finds himself on the inside track. So he meets Carmen Jimenez, who's the head of the TNT, what that is, the TNA, the National Centre of Exhibitions, and who is the kind of state's impresario for the visual arts. And in effect, he's, without having direct power of his own, he's very close to power. He's on the inside. So he has this really interesting tension between somebody who has been thinking as a kind of leftist thinker, who's making this synthesis and condensation in his visual work, and what happens is a kind of I would say a self-silencing, a strategic self-silencing. He quotes Engels, in fact in a notebook a bit later in 1986, where he says, Engels says, the less that the artist says about their beliefs, the better for the work of art. And coming from Engels, one can assume that has a sort of political dimension at least. Anyway, that seems to be the way he applies it in his own work. So there's a self-silencing at a time when he is living these contradictions, the contradictions between uncanny memory and leftist politics, and to sort of make a true duality, and the society of the spectacle, and a kind of completely hedonistic involvement, and a sort of celebratory, vitalistic attitude towards art. So the opposition between inside and outside is one absolutely central dualism, if you like.
Right. And from a say, more criticism point of view, that is compounded with a very sophisticated sense of the position of his own art with respect to modernist art and the impossibility of doing things the way that prior generations have done it, and the influence of Duchamp and other. Do you want to say more about how he positions himself, his own art of his poetics with respect to postmodernism and the impossibility of doing art in the way the modernists did, but at the same time being very influenced by them?
Well, I think from the student notebooks are very, very interesting and rich, and very early on he is kind of trying to process the problem of his relationship to modernism. I think in a sense he's not that troubled by his relationship to postmodernism. Theoretically, his relationship to modernism is something that does trouble him. He says that he must create an absolute distance between himself and modernism, excuse me, but not separate himself from the modern, and not attach himself to what he calls some tree of the past. So he's very, very concerned about how he treats with these precedents, and I think that he takes an attitude. If in some ways, if postmodernism is a positive value for him, I think it's a way of it's like a sort of permissiveness. It's a way of treating any subject that he wants to treat without any aesthetic preconceptions. So it's a kind of liberalizing thing. I think the things that attract him with modernism are often heterodox modernism. For instance, the rock drill, which Jacob Epstein, which Epstein cut up, mutilated it, suppressed it. So that became a kind of unfinished thing, a repressed article of modernism, which then became very interesting by virtue of that repression for Muñoz. And he writes about that very richly at the same time that he's doing the Wasteland, and so the connection between the Wasteland dummy and the rock drill is extremely interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm. I've said before how much I liked in your book how you show Muñoz as being this artist, but also this intellectual. So necessarily your book is theoretically informed.
Yes, I pressed the wrong button. I'm so sorry. What India? The kind of.
Oh, there we go. It's back.
It's back. It's back.
Uh-huh.
Okay, brilliant. Thank
So
you.
I was saying, I really like the way in which you respond to Muñoz's own, theoretical sense and philosophical sense of his own work, and I think it's to your credit that you do really good introductions. So even for those who might not be familiar with Benjamin or might not be familiar with Levinas or Foucault and so on, I mean, you really make it really clear how relevant the concepts that you introduce, in the case of Benjamin, mostly about Rogue, and the allegory that you were mentioning, but also the question of shadow in Levinas and in other moments. But I thought that was really good also to show the enormous range of cultural intertextualities that there are in Muñoz, that range from being conversational with all those philosophers, but also being fascinated by mass culture. Parts of your book that I really enjoyed is when you illuminate the influence of Psycho, of Hitchcock's Psycho in Ventriloquist, looking at the double mirror and the question of humor and horror, and so I thought that was really beautiful. And also in Man in a Room Gambling, the radio project, how you connect that with David Mamet's House of Games. I thought that was really brilliant reading. So maybe you want to say something more about Psycho.
This is, thank you, this is Ventriloquist looking at a double interior, which is, again, quite a peculiar work. This was reworked in 2001 so that the implications of the dummy looking at these two pictures were kind of made even more clear, I guess, but in quite a subtle, weird way. So he introduced an animatronic movement in the mouth, so the mouth was sort of puckering as if it was trying to talk. So you got the ventriloquist dummy speaking or trying to speak, but not in front of the artwork, but not being able to say anything. And the positioning of the installation with the dummy back to the spectator who comes into the room and must approach the dummy via, a left or right shoulder, is quite odd. I mean, no surprise, but as you come closer, you see, okay, there's a dummy sitting on a plinth, and then you come round it, and you go, oh, right, okay, so it's actually the mouth, it's actually moving. And you have a little kind of double take of a shock. And of course, ventriloquist, Norman Bates's mother was a ventriloquist dummy, because Norman Bates ventriloquized her, was in the film pretended that she was still alive and just mimicked the voice. Perhaps, shall I read this passage about here? It's probably the best way of doing it. The dummy seems ambiguously both inside and outside the artwork, and relates to the drawings in odd ways. It sits about 6 feet away from the drawings, with its head at roughly the same height as the head of an average adult viewer. This position in front of the drawings, or rather opposite the gap between them, means that it is more or less in the ideal viewing position for the drawings, so that there is no right place for the spectator to stand in relation to the installation. This usurping of our rightful position destabilizes our point of view, provoking us into uneasy movement around the dummy. The triangle formed by the dummy in the two drawings seems introverted and claustrophobic. The suggestion of horror familiar from the Wasteland dummy is given a new twist here. The Wasteland dummy not only allowed us to approach from the side or the front, whereas this dummy, which faces the wall, must be approached from behind, so it appears to have less control over the visual field. At the same time, the encounter with the dummy is slightly deferred. As we move around the dummy, our backs exposed, we become uneasily aware of our own voyeurism. The feeling that the dummy, with its slightly sickly, soft grey skin, is a surrogate human, intensifies, and the strangeness of the scene acquires a dreamlike quality. The play between the dummy's passivity and an unsettling sense of its agency and control involves a characteristic double take. The spectator's approach and discovery recalls the terrifying climax of Hitchcock's Psycho, in which Lila enters the upstairs room where the fully clothed cadaver of Norman Bates's mother, whom Norman has ventriloquized in the early scenes with Marion, sits with her back to the door. Lila approaches the figure, and as she reaches out to put her hand on its shoulder, it spins around, revealing the dead skull with its rictus grin. She screams and throws her arm back in horror, inadvertently striking the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and in the same instant Norman Bates rushes in, knife raised above his head, ready to stab her. We see him over the cadaver's shoulder, with his grey old woman's wig and his maniacal expression doubling the cadaver's rictus. Sam Loomis bursts into the room behind Norman, and as he struggles to disarm him, we see another close-up of the grinning skull, the sockets of its eyes animated by the wildly swinging light bulb. In the final shot of the film, we see Norman Bates imprisoned, his face merging with his mother's skull. As Bates explained to Marion earlier in the film, shortly before stabbing her to death in the shower, "It's not like my mother is a maniac or a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes." So, the script.
Say more about the other the other kind of coupling with a film, the Mamet's House of Games, please, because I think that will also give you a chance to talk about the question of belief and betrayal.
Yes. Right. So, with this is 1997, but it was composed with Kevin Bryars in 1992, and at that time Muñoz was working on a big show for Ivan, Institute of in Valencia, Alto Moderno, with Vicente Todolí, the curator, who introduced him to the Mamets film. First, the House of Games, sorry.
House of Games.
House of Games, yes. And also Things Change, another wonderful Mamet film. And the kind of dynamic in this very strange kind of sound piece for radio, which is Muñoz's voice performing card tricks, obviously without any kind of visual accompaniment. So it's a rather perverse setup, because there's no way that you can keep up. But if you look closely at the script, you can tell that he's extracted anything that would make it comprehensible, which is a regular feature of his writings elsewhere as well. Or at least, this creating of gaps is a kind of constant. Yeah. Oops. Sorry. So we think, in struggling to keep up with this work, struggling to keep up with the description of the card tricks, that we are being sort of initiated into this world of illicit behaviour, and it's rather delicious, The vocal performance is wonderfully rich, and Muñoz's voice is like a sort of dancing voice. It's incredibly expressive. It's a seductive voice, and this kind of lure of the seduction into the illicit knowledge has very close connections or close echoes with Mamet's House of Games. It's a complex plot, but essentially the psychiatrist wants to find out about con tricks, and in the process she's seduced, literally seduced, and conned out of £80,000. So this idea that in focusing on the small trick, you miss the fact that this much larger, really disastrous trick is being woven around you, is kind of repeated in the structure of A Man in Room Gambling. That's a rather complex explanation. But
and it's also, in a sense, an allegory, isn't it, of the relationship between the artist and the spectator.
Absolutely, yes.
Because that's what's going on with the radio.
Yeah. So this in a sense is more explicit than in any other work by Muñoz. This dynamic of belief and betrayal. This is the last work that I look at in the book, and it's the end of a trajectory from silence to sound. So you're starting with works which gesture towards sound, and this is sound and voice describing images which are not there. So it's a kind of reversal. So again, he's setting up a gap, because he describes these absent images, and in that gap he creates all kinds of distractions. Gavin Breyer's music is the kind of accomplice in that, and perpetrates this kind of elaborate fraud on the listener, I'd say. So I think this work is also a kind of inquiry in a sense into the reflection on the relationship between the artist and the spectator, which is based on a contract of belief. And the idea that representation depends on this kind of element of belief, and that might be through the word, or the voice, or the image, or for the artist himself or herself. So it's again, it's the gap that he plays with and how the spectator falls into the gap. And also the way that the gap can act as a kind of arena for betrayal.
Yeah, and it's not only about art, but it's also that tension is also a commentary on life, on the spectacle of capitalism, right? Capitalism seduces us into believing, and it tricks us. So in a sense, it's complex because it's called, the belief is needed, but at the same time is the vehicle for being tricked.
Yes, exactly. I think there's a very important article by Thomas Lawson, which he alludes to, but without naming, in a very early notebook, and he says, it's all a question of belief. It's a very brief quote, but it's I think that's pretty much the quote, but that's the opening declaration of Thomas Lawson's article, where he juxtaposes the kind of the seduction by spectacle and the increasing difficulty in actually committed belief in images, the kind of destabilization of our relationship to a kind of truth factor in images, if you like. So I mean, the argument is about the need for artists to push back at that by the use of perverse, what he calls, Thomas also calls perverse strategies, which I think is like a perfect description of what Muñoz does for the next 2 decades.
How are we doing with time? Who's keeping time? I don't know. What time is it?
We wind up.
5 to 8.
So shall I have one more question, and maybe can I open it to the floor? Okay. All right. Let me finish by asking about Muñoz for today. I mean, he tragically died with respect to Spain, precisely at the moment when things with respect to historical memory were turning around and it was becoming explicit and very central, the need for the recuperation of that problematic memory, and really also the struggles of the desirability of that or not, and everything. And it brings us to the present moment. Tell me, what is Muñoz still relevant today? And if so, how?
I think he certainly is. I think the problem of thinking through this kind of tension between uncanny memory and the seductions of the moment. Du Bois' thesis that the society of the spectacle are kind of are with us and are going to stay with us. And I think that he produces images for that which are like problems that we walk into, and they challenge us to think about things. And every time we walk into these installations, they hit us in a different way. So I think they remain relevant, and that's on many accounts. I think that's a short answer.
Okay. So let's open the floor for questions. Do people have any questions for Mark?
There's so many things this brings up, Mark. It's obviously absolutely fascinating. I wish I knew more about Muñoz himself. He's obviously very elusive, but I was just thinking, having lived in Spain in the early 80s in Barcelona, I had a sense then, maybe I was naive, that actually something quite positive was going on. That something had been lifted, even though, okay, there was the Pacto de Olvido, a lot of things were being forgotten, but also some a kind of a democracy was being constructed. A newspaper like El País was starting, and it was pretty good in those days. The courts were becoming independent. People were living a life they hadn't been able to live. But it seemed like maybe that quite quickly sort of turned into something else. And Muñoz seems to have not been in any way sort of seduced by the idea that Spain was entering a sort of positive new sort of democratic era, which was the kind of story that was being put about.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think he was at all seduced. No, I don't think he was ever enchanted, or maybe briefly, with leftist politics, if that's an enchantment. But no, I think he was disenchanted, and he was always very attuned to what was going on in the politics of the day and the micropolitics of deals in Spain, you know, in the art world. He understood very well the kind of deals that you had to hatch in order to get ahead, and he didn't really like that. He was a very good analyst of cultural politics, and I think his grounding in politics when he was a student, I don't know what happened to that, to be honest. I don't know what happened in that self-silencing, but I think that remains a kind of intellectual framework, and according to that framework, how would he be enchanted? I think he wasn't. Yeah.
I remember people talking. Desencanto followed pretty quickly from,
Yes.
and people were already talking about Desencanto. I think particularly when Felipe González kind of, you know, blackmailed the nation into supporting into becoming a member of NATO. That seemed to be a pretty dark moment for many of my friends in Spain. That was quite early on.
It's quite a simple request. Could you take us back to that first figure and that first moment that you were transfixed and intrigued, and just talk a little bit about what you saw in it, what drew you to it, what blew you away.
Okay. Well, Muñoz's teacher, Santiago Amon, who's a very important figure for him, said to Muñoz when he was a 16-year-old, drown in a work of art. And I think this is a really good example of a work where you drown, because you can't help drowning, because you walk into the middle of it. The floor with its anamorphic pattern just kind of swirls around you and mutates and does very, very strange things. And you feel that that's somehow connected to this solitary, tiny figure of the dummy, and that they are somehow connected in there, that that's his domain. So the experience of being in the domain of the dummy is very peculiar and arresting, and you start to think about ventriloquism. Where is ventriloquism? What's he saying? Who is he? I started to think about how this piece is constructed, and having thought about how it's constructed, whether any kind of explanation would actually dispel the excitement of being in the strangeness of being in the piece. And it didn't, you know, for me. I think that there's always this tension. So you have the seduction, which seems to continue, however much you think you understand the construction.
I would like to ask about the repercussion of his work at Tate Modern, because I guess it was, at least in Spain, in the news, the critics were very amazed about that. But how about the British critics and everything? It was really a success, it seems, or?
You're talking about the retrospective or the
No, the
double
installation he made in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
2001, or was that?
I mean, because here they were, I think it was very well viewed. Adrian Searle, who was a very close friend, did very positive reviews of it, but maintained that it was a kind of a flawed work. I must say I thought it was a magnificent piece. Very, very kind of subtle in the way it infiltrated itself into, after all, an absolutely enormous space, as if it had been there all the time. But I think it was very well received, yes. Yeah. It's since been remounted, first in Milan and now in Lleida in Spain. So it's semi-permanent now on show. But yes, I don't know if that was what you were thinking.
No, just to know how was perceived here, as in
Yeah.
I was not here to see it, and so.
It was only the second of the
Yes,
Unilever.
And it's a challenge, such a big space.
Extraordinary,
So there's
yeah, I think in a sense it contributed to his death. I mean, it was
Yes.
the immense pressure.
pressure, yes.
Yeah.
Would you say that double blind has a connection with this work at the same time? Because it's like as if he's been developing this idea of
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, definitely.
the same work doing all the time, he's doing the same all the time.
Well, they look very different, but you know, the elements, the kind of colours in his palette, or the concepts that he works with, are tremendously consistent. So this is an early emergence of the figure, of a surrogate human figure in this case, in double binds. There's a relationship between the figure and the architectural environment, and an idea of infiltrating and unsettling that environment. So the architecture, the architectural environment becomes quite sort of resonantly metaphorical of, I think, in some ways, larger questions, for instance, the nation, potentially. The double bind has a whole kind of symbolism of heaven and hell and purgatory and or possibly these different dimensions. It's a much more complex work, but it's essentially the figure in a somewhat kind of heightened and peculiar and sometimes dystopian environment.
Mark, you mentioned in the book that he was a very cosmopolitan figure in comparison to others of his generation. You've also mentioned here that he was coming and going between the two countries. The title of The Wasteland obviously is potentially an Anglophone reference, I suppose. Not just British, but also American in a way. I don't know what it was titled at the Reina Sofia, whether it had a Spanish title or. But could you say a little more about this sort of go-between identity? Was it something he was actually actively engaged in? Was it a sort of conscious choice, or was it just a byproduct of his life?
Very much so. I think it's fundamental. You could say it's another of these dualisms or these tensions, and he increasingly, I think at the beginning of his career, he uses the alibi in a sense of his British formation in art school here as a means of disavowing Spanish content, and because he doesn't want to be pigeonholed as simply a Spanish artist. But increasingly through his career, his kind of canvas, if you like, his ambitions become wider to speak about more kind of existential, ethical issues, perhaps, and the dynamic of a home and abroad becomes really important. So this double coding of what can be understood by one audience and is not understood by another audience is something that he's constantly playing at. I think in the British context also, it's important that these were his some of his most intense formative years, this is where he was sort of working out his kind of conceptual frameworks, and so I think revisiting that periodically through his career was very important, and the memories that he laid down in London were immensely important.
Any more questions?
As far as I know, you spend a very great deal of time on the study. I was just wondering, were there a kind of striking moments or illuminating insights during that study you get and which changed your perspective or understanding?
Lots, I think, yes. I mean, I spent 15 years with a couple of years off here and there, and being able to do it over a long period of time is kind of takes. There are fallow periods, but I feel I've learned an immense amount from studying Muñoz's work, and there were certainly moments where just to move something 5 degrees to the left just changed the perspective completely. So everything crystallized. So the idea to place silence centrally, and this was particularly product of discussions with Simon, who's Simon Shaw Miller, and another point would be Mary Beth, you introduced me to you suggested it'd be worth looking at Jorge Luis Marto, a wonderful writer, Catalan writer, and he has extremely interesting things to say about ventriloquism, and that opened up, new dimensions. Is that kind of what you were after? No. No.
I was really wondering, if you spend that time on something, it must change your total perspective on it. It needs to be a life-changing experience. I was wondering about that small moment, tiny moment.
I'll have to think about that. Yeah. I think the whole thing was a bit life-changing.
I just read the book recently during the week in Sevilla, which haven't quite made it to the end, but I'm very out of my depth, not being in the art world at all. But starting with the Gavin Bryars work at the end, that didn't actually get broadcast, is that correct? There's a very endearing thing about how Radio 3 said it was for Radio 4, and Radio 4 said it was for Radio 3, and a producer sort of seemed to have really tried very hard. We've all had the sort of rejection, no, we don't think this is suitable. He seemed to try very, very hard, but said he just found it all terribly complicated. And but there is a recording, is there? Because you're talking about Muñoz's voice.
Yes.
So they recorded it, even though it never went out on the radio.
Yes, they recorded his voice for all of the programs, and it wasn't released until 2003.
Right.
But I was hoping to be able to play some of that recording, but yeah. Should we
join with a glass of wine?
Yes.
And we can talk more.
Yeah.
We can still discuss.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.